You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where we get great Australians, interesting people that can make a difference to your life, make you healthier, wealthier and wiser. And today we've got Jane Gleeson-White, who's an Australian author of 4 books, Double Entry, 2011. It's on Venice and accounting. What could be better? 6 Capitals, the story of new accounting models to address environmental and social crises of 21st century capitalism, Australian classics, and a 4th book, Classics. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, Brett. I've checked you out and I see we have a lot in common as well.
I love books. I'm an accountant that loves books.
They go together, don't they?
I think
books and accounting, as I discovered right back to the beginning of recorded time.
Yeah, amazing. So let me ask you, I always love to start at the beginning. Where were you born and grew up? And how did you sort of come into the academic career that you pursued?
I wouldn't even call myself an academic, but I was born in Sydney. I grew up around Bondi, so I'm a beach-loving Sydney-sider who has lived for the last 24 years since my son was born in inner city Chippendale, so I couldn't be further from the beach scene. It's all black in the inner west. And ever since I was 11, I wanted to be a writer. So I've always been obsessed with books and writing, which was apparently unusual at the schools I went to, but I've discovered it's not in my travels around the world. I loved both maths and English, like you, I love books and, numbers. And so I guess, it's interesting now because I have 2 children, both at uni, and they're sort of asking questions like, what do you do with your life and how do you know what to do and how do you make decisions and things, which has made me reflect on my own life, which might seem a bit random. Well, did seem very random to me and people concerned like my parents watching on. But always I just kind of set my decisions by going wherever I could do the most writing and reading. And I guess that did take me into academia, but only as a student and sometimes as a teacher. So I did a degree in literature, and then I wanted to be a writer, but I wanted to write about things that were the real world, So then I thought, maybe I'll try a law degree, but that I didn't find very inspiring. And so I thought I'll do economics and because I really enjoyed economics at school, and become a sort of financial journalist or an economics journalist, which I never found any doors in the conventional world open to me. So I guess I've sort of had to invent myself over and over. And the thing that really kind of introduced me into the back door of the world I'd always been interested in getting into was, by chance, writing Double Entry.
So this is a great book, and for our listeners, buy a copy of the book. It's absolutely fascinating. And in fiction, there's a sort of big historical fiction movement, but this is better than historical fiction. This is historical non-fiction, which is and better than me telling our audience about it. Tell us a story of how you came to write Double Entry, because this is a great book.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I have to say, I find it fascinating, this book, because I knew none of it really when I set out to write it. Also, between my 2 degrees, economics and literature, I had the incredible fortune to be an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice, where they had student interns, about 10 of us for 3 months at a time over the summer to help out in the museum. And so I was immersed in the magnificence of Venice and its beautiful art because I was there in a gallery. And so we had to learn about, the particular modern art of Peggy Guggenheim, as well as just surrounded by extraordinary Renaissance art, as well as just the beauty of Venice, the lagoon, So I just downloaded Venice into my bloodstream immediately. And then I returned and I was doing accounting. As part of my economics degree, I wanted to do a very traditional, like statistics, accounting, everything, rigorous economics degree. And I was at Sydney Uni, and in my first accounting lecture, the lecturer, who I've since learned was kind of a bit of an iconoclast anyway and a charismatic guy. So it wasn't unusual that he should have said this, but it seemed astonishing to me in an accounting lecture that the teacher should mention, when introducing Double Entry bookkeeping to us, that this practice was born in Renaissance Venice. And having just been in Venice and already becoming familiar with what some people might call the tedium of accounting, it just seemed astonishing to me that these 2 things, one so beautiful and the other so ordinary to me in my ignorance at the time, could have a connection. And that just sat in the back of my head for about 10 years, festering away, kind of, making me more and more curious about this connection. And after I'd written 2 books, my books on literature classics and Australian classics, my publisher said to me late at night in a King's Cross bar around 2 a.m., "So Jane, what do you want to write next?" And I went, "Well, actually, I think I'd like to write about accounting and double entry bookkeeping." And she just burst out laughing, thinking that I was joking. And I went, "No, actually, I'm really serious." And so she said, "Oh, well, if you can persuade me, write me a proposal." And so I did more. I'd done a little bit of research because I was just so curious about this subject. And it was at the time of the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. Yep. So Leonardo da Vinci was just everywhere. In trying to write a persuasive proposal for why this book needed to be written, I discovered that Luca Pacioli had been Leonardo da Vinci's maths teacher. And that was pretty much all I needed. They just went, "Okay, this sounds amazing. There's some unknown Renaissance monk who is the father of accounting, which has pretty much created the capitalist system as we know it over the last 500 years. And he taught Leonardo da Vinci maths. Yes, we'll take that book." So then it was just like carte blanche, including a trip to Venice and Milan, where Luca Pacioli also lived, and to San Sepolcro, just near Florence, where he was born. As he was pretty soon an orphan. He was apprenticed to a mathematician. Anyway, so in Italy, and then in the 2 years that I researched the book, I discovered the most extraordinary untold story, because who would ever be interested, who's a writer, in a story about an unknown Renaissance mathematician who happened to write the first published treatise on double entry bookkeeping?
Yeah.
Most people would just yawn and go to sleep. But it was fascinating to me, and it turned out to be quite interesting to a few other people too.
So the process of writing a book, and I know many of our listeners would love to hear this. So you pitched this idea. How many years did it take to write the book?
So I pitched the idea in 2008, which was also, as we all know, in the financial world, a rather telling moment in financial history. And I think that was part of why it was successful, because here was a moment when everybody wanted to talk about the things that were going wrong in our financial systems. So I pitched it in 2008. I went to Venice in 2008 because I went as, banks around the world were collapsing. And my publisher was thinking, "Is this good or bad for your book, Jade?" And I said, "I'm sorry to say, I think it's good." And then I did so much research for a year, like a maniac. I'm kind of a maniac. Once give me a library and, a subject, and I'm away. And then, so that would have been 2009. And in 2010, I wrote a huge draft, and then sort of rewrote it. So, it's really just an adventure into the unknown. But because obviously you can just hear how still excited I am by this subject, that you're just driven, and it's never boring. So you're just kind of captivated. So, I mean, that'd be my only advice to anyone who wants to be a writer. Love your subject. Don't even think about what people might want. Do what you want. I mean, no better example could be double entry bookkeeping. Who would think, what publisher would think that a book on accounting, the history of accounting, could become an international sort of success? So just follow your own passion. So a year of research, then a year of writing, redrafting, and then I submitted it to my publisher in probably early 2011. And then there was a whole lot of, because actually when I first set out to write it, I still thought I was writing a book about Renaissance Venice, a mathematical revolution, which was the arrival of Hindu-Arabic numbers and algebra, and, a monk and Leonardo da Vinci and art and culture. And when I submitted the manuscript, the publisher and editor said, "Jane, do you realize, I mean, this is really wonderful, thank you. Do you also realize that if you just kind of remove those Renaissance veils of Neoplatonism and esoteric mathematics, you've actually written a really good history of accounting?" And I just went, "Oh my God, no, I have not." How could, that was sort of like an identity crisis. How can I, the person who writes about literature and, art, have written a history of accounting? So I didn't even really know what I was writing, but I saw that they were right. So then I had to go away and remove the veils of esoterica and reveal the true book, which was History of Accounting. And so then it came, so by mid 2011, it was with the printers, and it came out at the end of 2011. So, that's really a 3-year process. Pretty intense though.
Yeah. And had you done this PhD in creative writing before then or after then?
No, so then after double entry came six capitals, because the success of double entry took me around the world, and then I just met accountants saying we're in a crisis, post 2008. There are all sorts of value that we're not accounting for, that we must account for to make rigorous financial statements. And this is an ongoing evolution that I'm sure you're very well aware of. Sustainable accounting and non-financial accounting. So then I wrote Six Capitals.
Which is ironic in that they did such a bad job of accounting for facts. And now,
well, that was another one of the many ironies. I mean, it's a beautiful art, accounting, isn't it, Brett?
What's so interesting is how often people in creative industries have believed that, accounting's boring and art's interesting. And yet I've always, some of the most creative people I've ever met are finance people. And business builders and in terms of real vision and manifesting, it's one thing to look at an empty space or a block of marble and manifest a replica of something that exists. So a great sculpture, of a person carved out of a piece of marble is amazing, but it is simply the recreation of something that exists. But somebody that conceives of something like Disneyland that doesn't exist. There was no theme parks in the world. And, I remember reading about Walt Disney, and he wrote his brother was an accountant and he couldn't, and he was in New York trying to explain to the financiers what his brother was talking about. So his brother stayed up all night one night and drew this, who was a draftsman, this huge picture of what in his mind he saw Disneyland being. And, they got it over to New York, and his brother showed it. Roy Disney was an accountant, so he showed it to all the financiers, and then they could see what he was on about. But it was that, again, combination between the drafting, artistic, imaginary skills of Walt and his brother, who understood, who was an accountant and could then explain it and interpret it to other people that were blind. It was so interesting. But again, in building that business, that was art. That was creating something that didn't exist. There'd never been a theme park in the world. Nobody had even thought of it. And so to me, that's even more creative than painting a picture of something that already exists. I see painting, a lot of Renaissance painting is so technically amazing and beautiful. And at the same time, it's simply capturing what exists that is beautiful. Whereas somebody that creates something from scratch, like the city of Venice itself, out of nothing on piers, creating a city, to me, that's an act of business and building and other skills that are seen as quite boring, but I think are amazingly creative. So then I read your second book on accounting, Six Capitals, and what I thought was so funny, and I have thought was quite bewildering actually post the financial crisis, is that all these accountants who couldn't, who become sort of postmodernists and can't recognize what's objectively true and capture it in numbers, which is what double entry does, are off with these much more esoteric ideas of, well, how shall we account for the, environmental impact of whatever you're doing? And it's like, well, look, mate, financial crisis came around because you started to represent facts in quite fictional ways to mislead and deceive people. So I read the second book and I thought, it's interesting that post the financial crisis, instead of it being maybe we need to be more honest and transparent around facts and tidy that mess up, we've gone, essentially moved the goalposts again and tried to account for things that are, almost in the realms of philosophy, in terms of trying to capture what's very hard to touch. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just hard to do that if you're not doing the basics well. And I guess that's what, in meeting young accountants, I always say to them, in the 28 subjects you do in a bachelor's degree, double entry bookkeeping a business degree is virtually the only thing grounded in fact. And that's what makes it so beautiful.
Brett, first of all, huge enthusiastic nods and shivers up and down my whole body when you were talking about the creativity of business people. Yes, 1,000,000%. And that could almost be the sort of tagline of double entry. Really, it's about the ingenuity of entrepreneurs who have created the whole world. And you use the perfect word, manifest, because they're actually realizing their visions in in all sorts of forms, and not the least being bricks and mortar and Disneyland and things. What a beautiful story. There's always an accountant in the background in those stories. It's really, it was really fascinating, deeply getting into Marx around how he drew on double entry bookkeeping. There was Engels sending him the accounts from the Manchester cotton manufactory, which is another footnote of history. I think double entry is really just all the footnotes of history brought into a story that are actually really, really interesting. But
that's one of those interesting themes, is the accountants behind, so many of these things.
Yeah,
really.
because that's what I became quite captivated, as is probably evident by the fact I've written 2 books about accounting, by the fact that it seemed to me that the accountants were at the interface, exactly as you've just described with the Walt Disney story, between the imaginary and the real material world. It was like they worked at that interface, which is why I began to follow what they were doing with Six Capitals, because I just learned that they were kind of at the forefront of every revolution that we've attributed to other things, from the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance, the invention of writing.
And you can see it now, like with what's happening at the moment. You can see that this, it's the accounts that have to grapple with, is climate change real? Well, that's a whole scientific punch up, and that's great. To what degree is humanity contributing to environmental degradation? That's not a very difficult thing to understand or see. All those plastic bags in the ocean are quite obvious, and the impact of them on sea life is pretty,
devastating.
There it is, right?
Yeah.
So then what's so interesting is seeing, the accountants, if you like, try and work out, well, what should be the provision for choking dolphins with your plastic bags, and how do we actually bring that back to the source of that degradation?
Your kind of appraisal of the movement that I recount in Six Capitals, which is absolutely 1,000% spot on. All power to Brett, Kelly. It feels like I have, because I was so immersed in following what they were doing, because there are men of great conviction, and I say men because they are all men.
They're almost men.
Yeah, there's one woman, and as I was saying to my son last night, I had to declare her the foremother of this movement, because otherwise there would have been no female presence in this whole thing. But I 1,000,000% agree with you, and it took me through many tortured kind of routes to arrive at what you say, which is that this is an area which is essentially philosophical. It's certainly ethical. How do you put a value on what is, in, as we say, non-financial value? It is the value of a community and a worker and love. And, I just found what you said fascinating, and you just put in a nutshell, and in a way better way, all the misgivings I've had for the last 6 years. So thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Look, I did my master's in tax, and I was always interested in social how tax policy shapes social policy, and how social policy shapes
it's
policy,
critical.
and what the impacts are, how it's accounted for. And so in reading both of your books, and I just say to our listeners, you might love fiction or you might love Netflix, but I just think reading has just an unbelievable power to transform people's lives. And these are books that will cause people to think. And everyone's an accountant, in that ultimately everyone's accountable for how they live and what they do. And everyone's trying to make an accounting of what they are doing and how they're doing it and what it means, and ultimately what their life adds up to when they come to a point where they're considering their legacy, which I think is so interesting. So that's why I think that's so interesting. But that point you make in the book, where the sort of, to me, the sort of mother of all ingenuity or invention is sort of strife and calamity and big problems. We're doing this trade. We're putting stuff on boats. They're sending us stuff. We're sending them stuff. It's interesting that the more, there's that great old song that everything old is new again. That the more things change, every generation thinks that they're at the vanguard of change, when to me they're really wrestling with problems that we've seen before. So I absolutely love Venice. And what's so funny is I saw your book, and because of the beautiful cover of Venice, I thought, oh, a book. And I've read so many books on Venice I've spent a lot of time in Venice. I absolutely love Venice. And I'm completely jealous that you got to spend 3 months. It's the greatest thing ever. Speak more to us about Venice. You spend 3 months there. It's an extraordinary place because it's something that, even though it's now so associated with art and architecture and beauty, it has really mercantilist and practical reasons for its existence. Can you share that bit of that story with our audience?
Yeah, well, that makes me shiver as well. Such good questions, Brett, because, I mean, most people, many people in my circles just love Florence because it's so, it's the Medici, it's the iconic art center. And Venice is this kind of more troublesome, difficult, opportunistic sort of breakaway place, which is also why I love it. So it has a really fascinating history, and it was just a swamp, which is still a bit evident today.
On the wrong day, it can smell like that.
Yeah, well, totally, absolutely, yes. So you bring Venice back in its full glory now with that allusion to its smell. But yeah, so I think it was around, the 1100s, the thousands, that Venice suddenly became, so Genoa, Florence, Rome, obviously Rome, they were bigger centers already with, and Venice was this kind of backwater. And then it became very rich on salt. Because of its, seaside location, it became a center for salt mines. And then, so then the city of Venice began to be built. And then during the Crusades, it was in the perfect location. So the Crusades, which really kicked off around the same time as the salt. I mean, maybe the salt came a bit earlier, 900. But it was the Crusades which kicked off Venice because it was a departure point for travels to Constantinople, which was then the wealthy center of the divided Roman Empire, and then to the Middle East, to Jerusalem to vanquish the infidel. So Venice was this incredible place. I mean, like New York, like all the big cities we know, London, that are centers of mercantile trade.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon? Port cities, exactly. The fascinating,
they're all outward looking.
Outward looking and a bit, edgy because they draw so many people, like they're melting pots of the world. So Venice had all of that. It was just like this extraordinary place of foment and cultural complexity and, really fascinating place. And as you say, mercantile, a port city. And so really opportunistic, really, really opportunistic in the best sort of entrepreneurial sense. And I mean, I think I don't know, I did not know this, and maybe some other people don't really appreciate this, 500 years on, that the church, the Church of Rome was actually a big business organization. Actually, we might know that better today. It seems to be coming out a bit more today, but it really was just a business organization, and it owned most of Europe, and it was incredibly wealthy.
And incredibly well structured.
Incredibly well structured, hierarchical to the max.
Yeah, interesting today that, virtually every business is more structured like the Catholic Church than they even comprehend. It's one of the great unstudied topics in my view.
Well, that's interesting because I've always heard that, modern businesses are sort of structured on, for example, Napoleonic troops, but maybe that's based on the structure of the church. Yeah, no, I love this idea because the church is huge.
Yeah, they think that, but McDonald's has, buys the hill and sticks up a big cross, a big M, and lights it up.
Oh, don't get me started on a new subject, Brett.
Do you know what I mean?
These are the sorts of things that really capture my interest, all that kind of symbolic language. But I mentioned the church because Venice was so opportunistic that it had no allegiance really to the church. It would play off the infidel again, so it was excommunicated from the Catholic Church because it refused to obey the church's law on trading. It allowed Jews to practice and money lend, so there's that famous ghetto in Venice, Jewish ghetto. So it was really a wild, untamed place of commerce and opportunity. And for example, one of my favorite stories, because I'm obviously very interested in the new press and the development of the book publishing printing trade, so the printing was invented by Gutenberg, as we say, in, the 1450s. And people at the time thought that it would be used for good, noble works like, the works of the Bible and of the classical scholars like Cicero, but they couldn't make, a business out of it because not enough copies of those books sold. No one wanted to read them. And there was a newly literate class of merchants who spoke not Latin, but the Italian of the people. And in Venice, book publishing, or a new printing industry opened up, which catered to those people, to the merchants. And suddenly the sort of numbers made sense in publishing because they were publishing.
So that's why it's such a book, seems always such a bookish paper, right?
Well, and it has, yeah.
And it is. Great literary history of attracting writers from all over the world.
Well, it does. And it's again because they understood that, they understood their market, I think is the best way to put it. They knew that it wasn't about selling copies of the Bible. They knew it was about selling racy stories of, some of the first books that were published were about how young women should behave. I mean, interestingly enough, there's a whole other book in that. And, and books like Luca Pacioli's, because his little 27-page bookkeeping treatise was an afterthought to his huge 1,000-page history of Encyclopedia of Mathematics. That was unbelievably a bestseller. And that's how Leonardo da Vinci discovered him, because he bought his history of mathematics. So, yeah, Venice and commerce. You make me excited about commerce again, Brett, just when I'm trying to move into a whole new subject.
Oh, I think you hardly started. I think there's so much there. I think you're right onto something. Like so interestingly, I was walking down the street in Venice and a mate of mine showed me it's a 1,000-year-old church. And what's so interesting, it's off on one of the glass-blowing islands.
Oh, yeah. Murano, is it?
Yeah.
Murano or Burano?
So I should look it up. And, if you didn't know it was a church, you'd think it was a mosque. In terms of its domed architecture and whatnot. And so it just always struck me that there was a Jewish ghetto. There was these churches that were very innovative in terms of design, and the architecture there was always so innovative.
Much Byzantine. It wasn't Torcello, was it? There's an amazing church on Torcello, which
made in bricks.
I bet it was Torcello, or maybe not, but there's an amazing cathedral on Torcello, which is really Byzantine and sort of Arabic looking.
Yeah, so very, very interesting that this place, sort of hung off the edge of the coast, that there was so much innovation required just for it to exist.
Yes.
And that there were so, many people of different perspectives operating there, and the things that came from it. Was very much a foretaste of the future. But, on that 27-page bookkeeping treatise, I've just often thought that the ability for them to see, or for Luca to see with such clarity and to try and represent reality without ego, it was the thing that struck me the most, is that, when I look at Six Capitals, it's a book that's many more pages than 27 pages. And if you lined up all the men who you met in that process, few of them could express their thoughts in less than 27 pages, I suspect. And so I've often got this test in writing that I think I saw, it's almost like the often with prime ministerial or presidential or leadership books, in particular, prime ministerial, presidential books, that often the ones that do the least seem to write the longest books. It's more words, less substance. And so I kind of looked at that and I thought, here's a guy who's come up with a 27-page treatise that has made an impact on the world beyond what people could probably even imagine. What can you share with us? I guess my impression was the guy's a monk, and that was very consequential to his ability to see clearly, to focus on a topic, to publish and work and make impact. Because at that time people had short lifespans. And I think the thing that struck me most was the first time I went to Italy, I was in Florence, where I went to the Uffizi Gallery. I hired a guide, and she said to me, I said to her, why are there so many skulls in these paintings? And they, in the great way the Italians did it, they're slapping them 50 on a wall, right? They got so much of this treasure, and it's just everywhere. It's sort of beautiful mayhem. And she said, well, they would have a skull on their desk, often monks with a candle in it to signify, that time is limited and death is certain. I've never forgotten it. And so what can you share with us about this monk that wrote this short treatise that's had so much impact? Do we know much about him? And, how did he get there? How did he work this out?
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question. Well, he was the sort of big enigma at the heart of my book, because there's not very much known about him. And again, it was a matter of reading a lot of footnotes on Leonardo da Vinci books, and Vasari, who wrote The Lives of the Artists, has a few asides about him. But what we know is that he was born, sometime in the 1440s, and was apprenticed. He was born in the same town, San Sepolcro, as Piero della Francesca. And for a long time, it was thought that Piero, the great mathematical painter, who was one of the forerunners in, painting perspective paintings, the familiar, sort of geometric black and white tiled grids that showed, distance in a painting, was his teacher, but probably not. So, I always think of him as someone who just read his times perfectly, either because that was where the opportunities were or because he did have this kind of foresight. So he understood immediately that the future was in this new mathematics, and in trade. So he was apprenticed to a merchant. He learnt the art of double entry bookkeeping, which had been established and practiced by the merchants in Italy and had probably come from the Arabs for about 100 years. And there were many different varieties of it. And it was evolving when Pacioli learnt it in San Sepolcro. And he obviously excelled at it and in mathematics, because he then traveled to Venice at a very young age and was apprenticed to a successful merchant as the tutor to his two young sons. And that's when he began writing. And, he must have been as captivated by Venice as we are, Brett, because he made full kind of use of everything that was available at Venice, which at the time was incredible visiting intellectuals and speakers that would hold forth in the squares on all sorts of amazing, because this is the Renaissance. This is a revolution, not just in art, but particularly in mathematics and philosophy. And it's a rediscovery of the classics, and it's, rereading Aristotle and Plato, and, so it's an incredibly fertile intellectual time. And Luca Pacioli just lapped it up. So that was really...
Because there was no Netflix and no Facebook?
No Netflix. Netflix was, the speaker in the square.
So that's why I think about this guy, right? I think about this person in this place. And often people say today, I'm so busy, I have no time. And so I think of the state of life of this person who's in this place. A lot of people were there, People are often in a place, but they do nothing. And they do nothing because they're asleep, or they're preoccupied, or they're busy wasting time on things that are not consequential. So I'm just fascinated by this person who, it's one thing to be there. It's another thing to do something, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so while he was there, he wrote his great treatise, but he went in the meantime to Perugia, where he was a lecturer at the university. And he wrote several other books, and one of them he wrote there for his students, because he was you're right. He was a monk. He also knew that the Catholic Church offered a sort of career path. So he sort of quite consciously, and at the advice of one of his mentors, one of the great humanist thinkers who advised him to go into the church, because that was a sort of secure place where you could travel freely. Because at the time, Italy was a series of city-states all at war, and, France was about to invade. There was, it was a constant dangerous place to be out on the road. And he was constantly traveling after, information and, teaching and learning. So the robes of a monk were kind of like a safe way to travel. And also they provided an income so he could be free to pursue his intellectual pursuits. And in his manuscript he wrote for his students in Perugia, he does break away from the text to say, I write long hours into the night by candle, so he was completely dedicated to his calling, which I think was a real vocation. And also, he did sort of stress out a little bit, I'm giving myself to my student, so he sort of performed himself as quite a, not self-sacrificing, but, he was dedicating himself to his work and to his students and to the higher calling of mathematics in the name of God, and I love the way that you kind of talked earlier about the way that we're all accountants and we all sort of do a reckoning and we all, try and sort of account for ourselves, because those early account books were developed, the kind of protocols in an era of, the dominance of the Catholic Church, and they all started in Laus Deo, in praise of God, and all the language, reconciliation of accounts. I mean, that's, you reconcile yourself to God.
So that's what I see is so lost, is that as a culture, we don't see the foundations upon which we're built. And so we're like unconsciously groping around in the dark, trying to account for esoteric things while we can't reconcile the basics in our own lives. And so that's why I thought this guy was so interesting, because he had this focus as a person that allowed him to focus on his work. And, I really see that, why does it matter if things don't add up? That's a philosophical question, right? And so in a sort of lying, cheating, stealing, self-delusional, individualistic, materialistic and hedonistic world, then accounting doesn't really matter. And so, culturally, the idea of taking account of yourself, let alone anything else, has become pretty out of fashion. So to me, that's the problem with accounting. Is that
I am loving this way too much.
You know what I mean? Like, it's done by, done by people. Like, how can people that are dishonest with themselves be honest with accounts? And there's a great book out on the Big Four that's, I think, similarly interesting, that looks at the founding of the Big Four accounting firms and who the men were that founded those firms and what their, it doesn't say enough about the values and ideas that formed those men to start those firms and how they grew, but they effectively grew out of society demanding, accountability. And there were particular strains of thought that were quite suitable for that. There's probably strains of thought that aren't. And so I see 2008 as being, where your 2014 book is a looking forward book. It's almost like what went wrong in 2008 is a lack of looking backwards to say, well, how did we go from a monk who thought that you should reconcile things honestly and accurately to the delusion that we practice today?
I'm so fascinated. I've been traveling, Double Entry came out in 2011. So even though Six Capitals only came out in 2014, the conversation started in 2012 when I was invited, to speak in New York and things, and started hearing these stories about this new accounting paradigm that was being published in 2013. If I'm talking about the International Integrated Reporting Council, I mean, there are many other versions of it, of the multi-capital accounting. But so I've had so many conversations, including in New York, where I've, traveled quite regularly since Double Entry came out, with accountants who maybe 5 years ago would have said exactly what you say, were skeptical but have now sort of metaphorically bought into the new accounting paradigm. But I actually think, after my long journey in that world, that you have said the most intelligent, true thing that I have heard about it, which is that, and that some of these people would have previously said but have now taught themselves out of believing, that really the problem was the actual financial reporting was in utter disarray and being practiced by many charlatans, both the accountants and the corporations. And that's what needed to be thoroughly reckoned with, and not any fancy idea of what you're saying are more philosophical, and I'm 1,000% agreeing, and calling ethical questions of, non-financial value. I find that astonishing, and it makes me so happy.
So that's how I read your book. Like, I was reading your books and I was like, I'm running an accounting firm, so I don't have time to research. So I look at this monk who came up with 27 pages, and I think, well, could we have divorced the clarity of his thinking from the way he conducted himself and his own, today it's big fashion to talk about purpose of organizations. But in my view, difficult. It's difficult to have a board of directors whose personal purpose and values skew if and end up with an organization that has values and direction that make sense. And so I look at this guy who wrote this treatise and say, well, this was a person spending a lot of time thinking deeply through how to represent, what is hard to touch and feel, very accurately. And I think because, in all likelihood, he put himself together well, that he was able to see this clearly. And I just, because I love books so much, I was in a bookstore the other day and I looked at, one of my sons pointed to, and I won't mention a former prime minister's, reflection on their time in office. And it was a short time in office, but a very long book. And he said, he picked it up. And I said, well, it's so often the case, Tom, that, those with a focus on themselves and not much to say write the longest books. And often some of the best, and I think I was so interested to talk to you about, that some of the most consequential people in human history have written nothing on themselves. Absolutely. And there's so little that you can find, So I think of this guy who's genuinely changed the world. Steve Jobs would stand up and say, hey, we've changed the world. And I'm sure, to a great degree he has. And he's an interesting guy in the sense that he never wrote anything about himself. But he's a guy who really has changed the world. He wrote nothing about himself. No one wrote anything about him. Was toiling away at this thing by candlelight, literally in the in the dark, and has made this massive impact. And so often, as a general comment, I see that life moves on and doesn't actually see the people that make the most difference.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the joys of writing the book as well, to kind of say, look, here was this guy who did this that we don't even know about, and he's getting dissed by Vasari, and he's
yeah.
But just while you were talking,
I love that story. I just loved how there was this little foot. So everyone knows Da Vinci, right?
Yeah.
Like, huge brand now, literally a sort of modern brand. And then you say, well, what do you know about him? Well, I don't know, but he's a guy. And there's this little footnote guy who I'd argue has had more impact than almost anyone.
Oh, totally. And what you were saying just then reminded me, about what Luca Pacioli did and how he conceived this thing in such a succinct form. And I'm 1,000% with you. I'm all for, brevity and clarity, which is really two of the, guiding lights of accounting. Really, the best accounts are brief and clear, and there are a few of them around these days. But I was thinking, actually, what Luca Pacioli did is very similar to what you were describing about Disney's brother, in that, so here was a practice that was already around in Venice and Florence and Genoa in various ways being practiced, double entry bookkeeping. And Luca Pacioli was the one who could, it was when you're putting your hands above your head, then I thought, so he was the one who could see it and formulate it in this clear way that accountants say, I'm not an expert enough to know, but accounting historians say you could teach a student today from his 500-year-old treatise how to do double entry bookkeeping. So that is its timelessness, because it was just a beautiful distillation of a practice.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Now, what next? So what does a writer, do next in your situation?
A writer like me, well, first of all, I did my PhD in creative writing.
Yeah,
in order
I was fascinated by that. What was that all about? Well,
that was about another book that's been, eating away at me for a long time, which was a novel. But so I started my PhD in 2010, just before double entry came out, thinking, I'll just do my PhD and, become a creative writing teacher. I've always been trying, as I said, I've always been trying to look for some institution that will accept me as their, so I'm always sort of on the periphery, which I actually think is very good for a writer, because you don't get, you don't live off the fat of the land. You're always starving and have to, fight, sing for your supper sort of thing.
The tyranny of being in the middle of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, so I've never had that privilege. But then double entry came out and just exploded, and that kind of, really diverted my PhD. So instead of a novel, my creative work with 6 capitals, I think my supervisor was horrified, but it ended up being a really interesting project, obviously. So now I'm still, now I'm back with that novel, which is actually about the Pacific War, which has sort of family connections. So it's had many iterations.
So you did a PhD to work on, and that was to work on that novel.
Yeah. Because a PhD is this fantastic sort of opportunity to spend 4 years where you have to write, you have to write this novel, Jane. Yeah, but in the end, 6
And how close are you?
Well, I've got a draft. I finished a draft last year, and then I've been writing other stuff. I'm still called to write about accounting, as in people still want me to write on the subjects that, relate to double entry, sustainability, environmental stuff. But really, wow, Brett, I'm so taking to heart what you've said today. I really appreciate your clarity, about the whole non-financial accounting movement.
Yeah, it's a new religion for the irreligious.
Beautiful.
Because
you're a writer.
Because all the great thought movements sort of captured as major religions first called on major personal sacrifice. But the climate movement's the first major religion that's asked no personal sacrifice of its members. And so for sort of postmodernist Westerners, it's like the perfect invention. You can click on a like and make no personal contribution.
Wow.
So you get to browbeat others while doing nothing to reform yourself. So it's like the ultimate anti-accounting movement, and it's people of that mindset that draw up sets of accounts that lead to financial crisis. And that's ultimately how we got in my view, the environmental crisis. Is it's that blindness that causes, people not to be able to account for the things that they do that have impact on others, themselves, and the environment. But it's beyond the combo that most people can have with themselves, because looking hard at what you might do to yourself, let alone other people, has become culturally unacceptable.
I'm dumbfounded. I'm thinking, God, maybe my next book is a conversation with you. That's so fascinating. Are you writing?
Could you imagine if you said, look, I'm going to stand as an independent in my seat because I'm so pro the environment, and on every corner I'm going to put little bins where you put your iPhones and your iPads, your extra cords, your plastic bags, and all the you're going to refuse to buy more than one pair of shoes a year. You're going to reform your materialistic, sort of overconsumption and get voted in. It would be the most that you could do for the environment. But it would call on people to make radical personal change. And that's why I absolutely love Venice. And I think accounting has so much to recommend it. It's kind of the conversation stuff. But what do you do? I'm an accountant. Really?
Yeah.
But I've one of my little passion projects has been looking at the accountants behind that. So many things. There's a great book called Grinding It Out, which is the story of Ray Kroc, who built McDonald's, and the second most mentioned person in that book was his chief accountant. And without the innovations of that guy, that business would never have been the business it is. And I suspect that is genuinely the case behind the building of anything and the creation of most things. And so I've always defended accounting as being this thing that, it's kind of the yin and yang, and it makes a difference if it's done well. But
totally.
That's why I loved your book so much. So I was like, right, we have to find Jane. Where is she? Apparently she's in Sydney, which is amazing. I've so enjoyed catching up today, and we've run out of time. But and I try, for our listeners, I just want to recommend the books, and also, the comment I'd make with Jane here is that, what I love about these interviews is this is not. I describe you as not having lived a straight line of a life. Which I think
definitely
is
true.
Which I think is so amazing. But the sort of gold fault line is this love of reading and writing and intellectual pursuit. And I think you've made a huge contribution. I think it's so interesting. So I just want to thank you for spending some time with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Brett. It's been incredibly rewarding for me as well. I'm quite moved actually by all that you've said, and I really, I'm taking it to heart. I hope it doesn't make another book in me.
You'll be careful of that.
I know, I've got to watch it, because really you've said some very profound things, and obviously you've done a lot of deep reflection yourself. And I've found it fascinating. So thank you very much.
I'll finish with a comment. I want to see the movie. When I read the book, I thought it was so cinematic that that and ironically at the time there weren't the business movies being made that are, but they, there's this whole genre now of fashion movies, interestingly, on fashion houses, and that's moved into business movies on Facebook and Jobs and others. But it's a movie that should be made, and it might be another excuse to spend a few months into it.
Well, a few people have tried, so maybe it's in the offing. Anyway, thank you so much, Brett. I've really loved talking to you.
Thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.